They call Lake Superior the Gitche Gumee, big seawater, and she lives up to the name. I've spent 20 years on her waves, seen her moods change faster than a nervous groom at the altar. But what happened last week? That was something else entirely. The call came in just after dawn, a raw squawk over the radio that cut through the usual morning chatter, a mayday from the Iron Legacy, a modern Great Lakes freighter hauling taconite downbound for Detroit. The captain's voice was garbled, panicked, something about the ship shaking, lights flickering, then nothing, just dead air. The location put a knot in my gut. About 50 miles northwest of Marquette, right over the deepest part of the lake. That stretch has swallowed more ships than anyone cares to count. They whisper stories up here. Ghost ships, storms that appear out of nowhere, magnetic anomalies that mess with your compass in your head. I've pulled bodies and wreckage out of Superior's icy grip more times than I can remember. Each one leaves a mark. But a modern freighter vanishing in calm summer weather? That's a ghost story come to life. We scrambled the Sikorsky, the rotors thundering like a pissed-off giant. The flight out was smooth. The lake stretched out below us, an endless expanse of cold, dark blue under a deceptively clear sky. There wasn't a ripple on the surface where the Iron Legacy should have been. Just emptiness. The initial search turned up nothing. No distress flares, no life rafts, no debris field. It was like the Iron Legacy, all 600 feet of her, had simply been erased. The other lake carriers in the area were reporting clear sailing, no unusual weather patterns. It was as if the storm that the captain had briefly mentioned had targeted only them and then vanished. We started a grid search, our sonar pinging the inky depths. The water in Superior is so cold that nothing really decomposes down there. Ships that sank 100 years ago look almost intact on the sonar. We were hoping to find the Iron Legacy in one piece, maybe a power failure, something explainable. But the sonar came back with something else. Something big. Hull-like, but wrong. Too smooth. Too symmetrical. And it wasn't resting on the bottom. It was moving, slowly, deliberately, deep beneath the lake bed, miles below the freighter's last known position. I volunteered for the dive. You always do when it's like this, when the questions outweigh the answers. The water temperature down around 600 feet is near freezing, the pressure immense. It's a world of absolute darkness where your lights cut only a small, precious tunnel through the void. The wreck of the Iron Legacy was eerie. She sat upright on the relatively flat bottom, her navigation lights still dimly flickering from emergency power. The doors were all sealed, no signs of a struggle. It was like the crew had simply evaporated. But the strangest thing was the frost. Crystalline structures, like elaborate frozen spider webs, were growing on the interior surfaces. The bridge consoles, the galley counters, even the crew's bunks. It was as if the cold had come from inside the ship, not the other way around. And it was spreading. My dive suit's comm crackled in my ear. It was Lieutenant Commander Davies from the surface. "Rourke, sonar's got that contact again. It's moving deeper. And it's big, Chief, real big. Bigger than anything we've ever seen down there." I shone my dive light around the silent bridge of the Iron Legacy, the ghostly frost creeping across the instruments. A cold dread, colder than the lake itself, began to creep up my spine. Whatever happened to this ship wasn't natural. And whatever was moving beneath us, I had a bad feeling we were about to find out.
My training took over. In any wreck, you secure the Voyager data recorder, the VDR, the black box. It holds the last moments, the key to understanding what went wrong. It was located in a hardened casing on the bridge, and that's where I headed, my light cutting a nervous path through the floating dust in eerie silence. The VDR was there, but it was like nothing I'd ever seen. It was encased in the same impossible frost, which seemed to glow with a faint internal light. It wasn't just on the surface. The crystalline structures had grown into the seams of the casing, as if trying to merge with it. I reached out, my thick glove making contact. The cold was instantaneous, violent. It bit through the insulated material, a flash of pain in my fingertips, and for a second, my glove was frozen fast to the frost. I ripped it away with a grunt, a thin layer of ice clinging to the fabric. I radioed in. "Surface, this is Rourke. I've located the VDR, but it's covered in this crystalline formation. It's unnaturally cold. The whole bridge is like this." The line was silent for a long moment, longer than usual. Then my commander's voice came back, but it was strained. "Copy that, Chief. Stand by." Another silence. When he spoke again, his tone was different, formal, cold. "Chief Rourke, your orders have been amended. Secure the VDR and return to the surface immediately. I repeat, secure the VDR and abort any further investigation. A specialist team is being dispatched from NORAD to assume operational command." NORAD? The North American Aerospace Defense Command? For a freighter wreck on a lake? Before I could question the order, the hum started. It wasn't a sound. It was a pressure wave, a deep, resonant vibration that traveled through the water and the ship's hull, shaking the very fillings in my teeth. My dive computer flickered erratically. The needle on my backup magnetic compass spun like a top. The pressure in my head was immense, a disorienting, dizzying sensation. It felt like the lake itself was waking up. Then, as quickly as it began, it stopped. The silence that rushed back in was somehow heavier, more menacing than before. I didn't need any more encouragement. I secured the frosted black box to my harness and got the hell out of there, my ascent feeling terrifyingly slow. I was no longer just a rescue diver. I was a witness. And whatever I had witnessed, NORAD didn't want anyone else to see. The moment I broke the surface, I knew something was wrong. My familiar faces of my Coast Guard crew were gone. Instead, our vessel was occupied by several men in sleek, black tactical gear with no insignia. They moved with a chilling efficiency, their faces hidden behind dark glasses. One of them, a gaunt man in a civilian suit who introduced himself only as Mr. Stone, met my gaze. "Mr. Rourke," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Hand it over." He wasn't asking. His men took the frosted VDR and my personal dive recorder before I could even unclip them. There was no discussion, no protocol. I was no longer part of a rescue mission. I was a piece of evidence being processed. The debriefing took place in a sealed cabin. Stone tried to explain away what I had experienced. The hum? Acoustic vertigo, he said, a common side effect of deep water pressure on the inner ear. The frost? A rare form of methane clathrate crystallization. It was all clean, clinical, and a complete lie. He slid a stack of papers across the table, a non-disclosure agreement so severe the penalties for breaking it were equivalent to treason. "You had a difficult dive, Chief. You're on mandatory shore leave effective immediately. For your own well-being." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a threat. They took my gear, but they missed one thing. My dive recorder had a wireless backup, a feature I'd set up myself. Every few minutes it would sync a compressed data packet to a private cloud server. Most of the data from the dive was gone, wiped remotely, but one tiny corrupted fragment had made it through before they took the device. For days, I sat in my quiet apartment, officially on rest, but I was anything but. I worked on the file, trying to piece together the broken code. The audio was useless, just layers of static. But the video. There were 3 clear frames from my helmet cam just before the hum started. In the frames, the strange crystalline frost covering the VDR pulsed. It emitted a soft, internal blue light, a perfect synchronized flash with the vibrations I had felt. This thing wasn't just cold. It was active. It was reacting. It was alive. I now had the one thing they didn't want anyone to see, proof that their lie was a lie. I couldn't go to my superiors. They were either in on it or being silenced just like me. I needed someone outside the system. My mind went back to the stories we'd all heard, the local legends. I drove north, deep into Michigan's Keweenaw Peninsula to a remote, weather-beaten lighthouse that had been decommissioned for years. It was home to a man the locals called Crazy Gus. Gus had been the keeper there for 50 years. He was old, with a wild beard and eyes that held the deep, steady gaze of a man who spent a lifetime watching the horizon. I found him mending a fishing net on his porch, the Great Lake stretching out behind him. I told him my story. He listened without interruption, his expression never changing. When I was done, he just nodded slowly. "Took you long enough," he said, his voice raspy. "Most folks see a ghost ship, they call it a story. You've seen the thing that makes the ghosts." He stood up and gestured for me to follow him inside the lighthouse. "You're not the first to come looking for answers, but you might be the first to find something you can use." The inside of the lighthouse wasn't a home. It was a museum of obsession. Maps covered the walls, marked with strange symbols. Shelves were filled with logbooks and reels of magnetic tape. Gus had spent 50 years documenting the lake's secrets. He showed me his own sonar readings, taken with repurposed military equipment. He had recorded the sonar ghosts, the magnetic anomalies, for decades. And then he played me an audio file. It was an ultra-low frequency recording, pitched up into the audible range. A deep, rhythmic pulse, the same vibration I had felt on the wreck, the hum. "It's been down there a long time," Gus said, pointing to a map. "Comes from the deepest trench. Sometimes it's quiet for years, sometimes it pulses for weeks. The government knows. They've been listening since the 60s. NORAD. They have listening posts all along the shore, disguised as weather stations. They're not watching the sky, kid. They're watching the water." Gus believed the freighter was just the latest in a long line of incidents. The first, he claimed, was the real secret. He pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1963. It reported the loss of an experimental Soviet Typhoon-class submarine, which had vanished during the supposed goodwill tour of the Great Lakes. The official story was a catastrophic mechanical failure. "Nonsense," Gus grunted. "The Soviets were arrogant. They took their new toy for a spin, ran a deep scan sonar right over the anomaly. They poked the sleeping giant." He showed me his logs from that same week in 1963, a massive magnetic spike, unlike anything he had ever recorded before or since. And then, silence. The pulses from the deep stopped for nearly 5 years after that. "The sub wasn't lost," Gus said. "It was erased." That's when the serious cover-up started. That's when NORAD built their listening posts. The Cold War had a secret truce, a pact of silence between the US and the Soviets, because they both realized there was something in the lake far more important than their own squabbles. We spent the next day digitizing Gus's old data, feeding decades of his recordings into my laptop. I wrote an algorithm to search for patterns, and we found one. The low-frequency pulses weren't random. Over the past year, their frequency and intensity had been increasing exponentially. It wasn't just noise. It was a sequence, a system coming online. I overlaid the data from the Iron Legacy incident. Just as the freighter passed over the deepest part of the trench, Gus's sensors had recorded a massive energy spike, 100 times stronger than a normal pulse. The hum I felt wasn't an attack. It was the exhaust. I finally understood. The crystalline frost, the missing crew, the thing in the lake was powering up. And it had used the freighter's massive metallic hull as a conductor, drawing energy so rapidly that it flash froze the ship from the inside out. The crew, they weren't taken. They were probably just converted to energy, a power source. The sleeping giant was waking up, and it was getting hungry. I needed more. I needed proof from the inside. My Coast Guard credentials were still active. I used them to access a shared network, a low-security NORAD portal for interagency weather and atmospheric data. It was a long shot, but it was all I had. I spent hours digging, looking for hidden subchannels, back doors left by lazy programmers, and I found one. It was a live data feed, mislabeled as Geomagnetic Survey Z9. It wasn't a survey. It was a direct feed from the listening posts Gus had told me about. The screen showed a real-time energy map of the lake bed. It was no longer a single point. A massive, complex geometric grid of energy, miles wide, was now glowing brightly in the depths. It looked like a circuit board the size of a city.